all those things that apply to both meetings and emails, like there's the cover your ass meeting as well as the cover your ass email. Well, let's introduce the right term. It was the blue screen of death, and the terminals across the world glowed blue as this thing hit.
So now your metrics are all happy, but you actually haven't protected the underlying thing that you were trying to protect.
From Orion X, this is the Marketing Podcast. Marketing has transformed in significant ways. More technology, more data, more social, more blending of arts and sciences, more integrated with every other function, and ultimately more critical to the organization. Join Shahin and Doug Garnett as they discuss news and happenings in the world of marketing, from the boardroom to customer programs.
Hi, everybody. Marketing Podcast here. Another episode number 46. This is Shahin Khan with Doug Garnett. How are you, Doug?
I'm doing really well. I'm in Central Oregon where it's gorgeous, but a bit hot.
I know. I saw the photo of your breakfast table overlooking majestic mountains and beautiful, just beautiful.
Yeah.
All right. So we've been talking for the past, what seems to be like 5 hours. And we finally remembered to turn on the recording button here. So
I think
let's
it's only
do
been
it.
3 hours, but you know.
It feels more, but anyway. Yeah.
Okay. Well, shall we start with the cartoon?
Let's start with the cartoon.
I think it's a relatively understandable cartoon across the radio waves or internet, which is there's three people walking out of a conference. There's a guy in front looking at his phone, pretty typical. There's a woman behind him and then a guy coming out behind her that has a folder in his hand. And the woman turns to the guy and says, you know, this is one of those meetings that could have been an email, a really long, boring, asinine email. I mean, I responded instantly to it because I think we've all been in those. And at the same time, we've all gotten those emails.
Yes. And I wonder if we've all called those meetings.
I'll never admit it. Yeah, I've called a few of those meetings. And actually, we don't talk often enough, I think, in the world about how to learn to run meetings well. You know, there's a lot of people that will give you like, here's your checklist for a good meeting. You know, a good meeting happens because people feel involved. They feel like the topics are important. They feel like they're heard. I mean, there's all kinds of things that are important that you just won't find on checklists.
So my initial reaction immediately went to when you receive an email and you don't read it. So if this were an email, you would not have read it. And the fact that it's a meeting you attended, and that was the way they would have forced you to read the email. But then it doesn't address the case where the email was unworthy of being read. So
it gets us into all those things that apply to both meetings and emails, like there's the cover your ass meeting as well as the cover your ass email, where when eventually somebody says, well, why didn't I know? You're able to say, oh, but I sent you the email.
That's right.
And sure enough, they go off and look in their inbox. It's there. A lot of people, I think, do that with meetings. Yeah, well, we had a meeting. And
that's right.
When it's used as a justification, it's obviously silly, just important in the normal everyday work, but a serious problem when companies are too political and end up where that's really the sum and total of their meetings. It's all about that stuff, not about getting stuff done.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is, why are you meeting? Like you alluded to. If the purpose of the meeting is valid, then, and there are multiple objectives for a meeting. Not all meetings are supposed to be boom efficient. Sometimes you are trying to brainstorm. Sometimes you are trying to deliberate. And sometimes you do need to cover a topic 5-6 times before you get clarity about it. So it really depends on why you're meeting at all. Sometimes I'm observing that there are meetings set up simply to make sure that you are paying proper attention to the topic. Like, unless there is a meeting set up, you actually won't read all the emails.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And your opinion really is needed. So people like get on your calendar to make sure that you actually do the work. That if you did on an email, it would have been fine. But, you know, since you're not, they're going to call a meeting. Yeah, they're going to have to call a meeting.
I think also, that even fits with communication in writing is difficult. And some people aren't able to make it, come alive in an email. And for them, a lot of times meetings are far better because it's something you can talk about quickly. That writing it down is a lot longer and
that's
take
right.
forever and not be useful time. So I think there's a lot of stuff. I think the thing that I hated most about meetings in my life is meetings that weren't about doing the work, you know? So I like meetings that are about the important, thick, juicy issues. And those are the meetings that I personally love the most. Now, I don't think every meeting can be, but I know that was something I was particularly sensitive to. How do you make sure the meeting is productive on the work that needs to be done?
Yeah. Also, of course, it's productive for who?
Yeah.
Right? If the big boss needs to call a meeting and spend 2 hours to get to what they need to do, and only 5 minutes of it was when you contributed, that's still worth it because that's what it took to provide it. And if it's a big enough decision, then yeah, that's the way it is. Yeah.
I worked for a guy once that it was really interesting because he saw all meetings through his own feelings about them. And it was really weird. We went to 2 meetings, 2 days in a row once. And we went into the first meeting and it was around business. We were, close to closing. And he didn't do much in it. And we walked out and he said, "Oh, we're not going to get it." I'm like, "No, we're getting that business." And we got that. But the other meeting the next day, he came out and he had dominated the meeting. He had not actually listened to what the potential client had talked about, and came out and said, "Oh, we're going to get that. That was a great meeting." And I'm like, "No, we're not going to get it because you didn't listen to the guy and didn't answer his question." And sure enough, we didn't get that. And it was fascinating to me, though, because it was clear that he only evaluated whether a sales meeting was good or bad based on how much he did in it. And, that's a really bad thing. We have to be able to observe sales meetings from a point of view of, are the right things happening to get us to close? And if that means me shutting up and not saying anything for that meeting, but we make progress, hey, I'm happy.
Yeah.
I got no problem with that,
Well, there seem to be words for it, but if you see the world through the lens or filter of yourself, you're going to miss out on pretty important info.
Yeah. You'll never see a lot of what matters.
Yeah. So speaking of lots of emails and meetings that happened this morning, and we're recording this on a day when most of the infrastructure out there was down because of a global IT outage.
Yes.
And we talked about that a lot. So set us up for that, Doug, if you...
All right. Today is Friday, July 19th. That's what we're recording, right? It takes us to get these up. So we recorded on Friday, July 19th. And last night, overnight, we had the Crowdstrike outage. Now, I expect that most people will remember that when you hear this. And what it did was actually pretty shocking. So the software is called Crowdstrike, and it's a security software used on systems around the world. An update was pushed out to all Windows versions, and that update caused all the computers that received the update to crash. Now, this wouldn't be so bad, except that it crashed, for example, the customer service terminals in airports for airlines around the world. And there's, air traffic. You can see the air traffic over the U.S. decrease with when this outage happened. And I think I was shocked because I didn't know there was a potential for kind of such a devastating outage. It even affected us locally. I've read that the Portland city in Portland, Oregon, has declared a state of emergency because none of their computers work. And the fix is not easy. I mean, you looked into the fix a little bit. It turns out the fix is not an easy thing.
It's not an easy thing. This had a lot of good lessons in it. And it's not a cybersecurity attack. This is truly just a mistake that happened. And right off the bat, the feature became the bug because the software is a solution for cybersecurity vulnerability. And its claim to fame, let's say, is that it automatically updates to the latest, greatest. So you don't have to deal with it. And if you're dealing with so-called terminal points, the end of the network where a device is sitting, and that device can be the airport terminal or it can be your refrigerator. And Doug, you sent me a photo of a refrigerator that had a PC in it that was down.
Yeah, it was like one of those Samsung refrigerators, and the whole full screen on the front of it said it was down. Well, let's introduce the right term. It was the blue screen of death. And the terminals across the world glowed blue as this thing hit and wouldn't restart. It said restart to fix this. Well, if you restarted, you got right back to the screen of death.
That was part of the problem. So they couldn't, in the same automated way, to start undoing it. So essentially, in terms of proliferating the fix to a problem, they proliferated an actual bug. So the solution became the malware that it was trying to protect against. So right there, it's really interesting and amazing, but it also demonstrates the complexity of securing and keeping all these services up and operating. And of course, you've written a book about complexity, so that led to a big discussion about the kind of complexity that leads to something like this.
Yeah, well, that and resilience, because questions of resilience are really important in the world of complexity. Complexity gives us a lot of insights into resilience. Well, what is resilience? Well, I think what we saw last night was a brittle system, right? So dependent on this one piece of software. So many, critical services around the world ended up dependent on this software that this mistake, benign mistake, you would hope, usually, had a devastating result. I mean, that's the ultimate of complex behavior, when one tiny error pushing the wrong software out takes down every airline in the world except Southwest. But we'll come back to that.
That's right.
So we talk a lot about resilience, and resilience is a question of, when something bad happens, does your company withstand it? How does your company come out from what happens? Are you able to, sometimes you can breeze by things if you're resilient enough, things that would have destroyed other companies, and your company survives it just fine. So there's a lot of discussion here that is about resilience. I was shocked to find out that a quarter of the world's PCs depend on this software. Apparently, I don't know if it's quite quarter of the world's PCs or quarter of the world's people who need this high level of security. But I know my son works in a company that was also taken out. And I haven't talked to them lately to find out how it worked, but, it brought a lot of things to a full stop. And, how could we be so dependent on this one thing? I think it gets a little bit to, an issue. We think of the internet as this distributed free thing. I've got a new comic pulled up here that somebody says in 1969, let's create a distributed network which can survive a nuclear winter. And then it moves fast forwards to 24 that says, let's host half of it on one company and see how it goes. So we've got a distributed system, but we hosted half of it in one place. And that's what happened here, is too many people are depending on this one thing. And, I'm sure we can get into the execution underneath about whether it, maybe their execution was wrong and there's process, but nonetheless, it's scary. If you run a business and, suppose you're a small shop owner, if it took down your credit card for the day,
you're done. Yeah.
You're done. You're in trouble, and you don't have any way to plan for that exactly. And so I think it ties back in. We've talked about this for marketers with, you become heavily dependent on Google, and then Google changes their search algorithm, and all of a sudden you could see your sales drop by 25 to 50%. You can't plan for that, and yet those things are out there. And this raises these questions of what made resilient.
Yeah. So in the computing world where you and I came from originally, the notion is called RAS, for reliability, availability, and serviceability. Reliability means things don't crash to begin with. Availability means that they are available despite some crash, and that's the resilience that we've talked about. And then serviceability means once they do crash, whether or not they're up, we can service them quickly so they can rejoin the force. So right there's a lot of complexity. And what you try to avoid is the so-called single point of failure, SPOF. So you really look at what your single point of failure is. And obviously it could be a computer. Within the computer, you have redundancies. So redundancy is to give you the resilience. And in fact, that's one problem with super efficient systems, is that efficiency is gained by eliminating redundancy, and then eliminating redundancy causes lack of resilience. So when something goes wrong, it's harder to get it back up. And this is one reason why super efficient systems need to be left alone and not messed with. But then you can replicate the computers, you can replicate the data centers, you can replicate actual sites. You replicate sites outside of electrical grids. Mm-hmm. So if a whole electrical grid goes down, you have another. So these are called so these are called availability zones. Mm-hmm. Like Northeast is an availability zone, and like Northwest is an availability. So you try to spread things across so you can keep going.
But I guess, let me ask a question here that is bothering me.
Yeah.
Why would airplane XYZ, I won't use name, have their check-in system based on Windows computers underneath the counter? Right. I mean, in a sense, because, out of the background you and I came from, we knew a lot about these things, and a lot of mainframes were manufactured with a whole lot of reason that, one of the values of a terminal connected to a mainframe is you have only one point of failure. Once you distribute that point of failure to every check-in counter at United or every gate that United services at O'Hare, you got a lot of problems out there. And I'm a little mystified that so many people may have made the choice to simply rely on Windows computers for this. I mean, that's just, and I'm asking that honestly. I'm mystified by it, but I suppose it economically makes sense. But is it a smart choice?
Well, it is true that the Windows system has less of a good reputation for security than, let's say, a Mac or a Linux system does. And there is an aspect of that in this case. But the mathematics of the problem would be the same, is that if you really are relying on an agent, software agent, that you have installed on 10,000 things out there, on the face of it, you are distributed, but it's the same agent. So you are physically distributed, but logically centralized. And if that logical centralization causes a problem, you're not that different from the mainframe. It's the mainframe that's down, but the mainframe was spread across everybody.
So really what you've got is this balance between, in the old mainframe days, if the mainframe went down, every check-in terminal and gate terminal in O'Hare for United would go down.
Yep.
That's a big risk. Okay, we don't like that. So instead, we distribute and we make everybody their own workstation. Lovely idea. That seems to solve it. But as we do that, efficiency pushes us to use stuff like this single point software that is pushed out. And thus the failure ends up being the same as if you were still using a mainframe.
Exactly. So in fact, one problem here is a recurring problem in marketing, and that is the metrics. So if your metrics are make sure every device is secure, you can check off all those boxes. Say that very fix has now created a new vulnerability that doesn't have a checkbox next to it. So now your metrics are all happy, but you actually haven't protected the underlying thing that you were trying to protect. So it's yet another example of the proxies, the data proxies are not doing their job.
Well, I think it also very often it reminds me of, we see this obvious risks in certain decisions, and that will lead us to take one course of action. What we don't see are the hidden risks in the other course of. So, we'll choose between, course of action 1 and course of action 2 because, oh my God, course of 1 has obvious risks, so we'll do 2. What we don't stop to consider is where the hidden risks are. And there's a lot of hidden risks that come back to bite you. And that's part of what we try to, complexity tries to deal with. That stuff is going to emerge or pop up at some point in time and bite you in the ass. And so, this is one of the reasons you've got to care about resilience. I mean, you were talking about resilience here a minute ago. You mentioned, I was thinking, there's so many levels of resilience here. You've got this company's question of resilience and how they push out software. But you also have, and then you have resilience of how resilient are these computers. But I guess when I start thinking about resilience, I go back out to the business, and I'm thinking about the business's resilience that relies on these things. So if I'm that small shop owner,
that's right.
I have to be resilient against these changes, yet this thing is so far outside of my control. And obviously my ability to understand things, somebody told me to get it, so I got it. And yet I'm dependent on it.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Southwest Airlines, and they are, strictly speaking, not immune to this problem. But it turns out that much of their infrastructure on the PC front was running an old version of Windows.
And so they weren't using this. So Southwest Airlines brings us to this wonderful irony that, remember, I don't know, was it last Christmas or the Christmas before when their old computers caused everything to come to a stop?
Yes.
Well, this month, their old computers let them survive what took everybody else down.
Exactly.
Now, I'm not saying you should use old equipment to be resilient. That's not really the lesson, but I think it's pretty ironic that happened here. Hey, I think we should.
All types of memes on it too today that were pretty funny.
Oh, the memes were really great. I mean, I think my favorite may have been that some guy wrote, congratulated Crowdstrike for reaching its carbon neutrality targets 6 years early by disrupting global air traffic. So I thought that was quite funny.
Yeah.
But should we talk about the CEO's response? Because this was another developing issue, and it relates to a topic you and I were wanting to get to a little bit. Which
and
is
it came up in sort of context of crisis management. How do you communicate during a crisis? And just short answer, I thought his response was quite fine,
Yeah.
but
Mhm.
not everybody agreed. Yeah.
No, there was one person, and I'll leave them
Unnamed.
unnamed. Yes, I'll leave them unnamed. Well, because really, I don't. I mean, people say
Yeah, yeah,
stuff,
yeah,
and
yeah.
okay, they said it. But there was a person on Twitter that and they weren't alone. So that's, I think, the other
They were
thing
not.
is
No, that's right.
a lot of people said this, that came out and were blaming the CEO's response, the CEO of Crowdstrike. Both you and I went and looked at what the CEO wrote and went, wait a minute, say what? Because what I saw was the CEO issued a clear statement in an emergency describing what was going on and made sure he did that with minimal fanciness around it and just so people were informed.
Yeah.
But this person, so this is the one summary says, well, it was huge corporate speak. It was legalese. I actually didn't see that. I think it's carefully worded, but I would hope so. This is a real crisis. I would hope it's. The second thing I heard is that, and I saw this elsewhere, was he didn't apologize. This one really galls me because having been in crisis, apologies, if there's something that you need to do and you want them to do effectively, you've got to take care and do it in a meaningful way. And for the CEO, while he's just simply trying to help people survive this disaster, if you expect that the CEO should take a whole bunch of time out to apologize, I just don't get it.
No, I
But
thought his comment was focused on, here's the issue. We all have work to do. Let me be clinical in my response. I'm just going to focus on the problem at hand, and we'll come back and address, and they did, by the way, they did issue a blog where they did apologize for it. But right now we're trying to fix something. So right now is not the time to really take time, like you said.
mhm,
I also didn't think his response was particularly legalese or
I didn't
active
either.
tense or passive tense.
Mhm.
I think those were all, I saw them as the kind of communication that I would expect. And if I put my sort of IT person's hat on, I thought that's what I would have expected.
If you were in IT today, you just need to know what's going on. So let's cut to the chase. Tell me what's going on and do it with enough specificity that I understand it. And I expect that's what this commenter
That's right.
mistook for legalese is,
Yeah.
we are talking about very specific things here. And if you just try to do a broad, oops, it's out, nobody's going to. So he wisely starts describing, talking about it.
Also, you have to be careful that if you do an apology while everybody's waiting for the actual facts, then you're going to be blamed for taking time to apologize when you're supposed to help me fix the problem, So there is a bit
Well,
of
I think
a,
so, and I think maybe that's one of the realities of crisis is that no crisis is clearly winnable from the beginning, right? When they happen, you've got to respond, and this gets us, I think, Shahin, back to the topic we wanted to talk a little bit about, which is improvisation. Because improvisation is disliked by a lot of companies. I mean, the idea just makes a lot of managers and
why is
executives
that?
shiver.
Because it's unpredictable,
I think
or
it's because it's unpredictable and uncontrollable. I knew a guy who was CEO of a branch of a company that was purchased by eBay. eBay decided to close down that branch at some point. Now, this guy had been CEO for 15 years, worked with these people, the same people for 15 years, very close to his executive staff. I knew them all, and it was a really great relationship. And eBay issued the exact words he was supposed to use in one-on-ones with those employees. Come on now, wait a minute. That's like the absolute worst thing you could do. But he told me that he absolutely had to sit there and read the specific words that had been doctored up by somebody for saying, we're going to close this down. And, I don't know what they were thinking, but I think it's a fear, just a corporate fear that, well, he might say something. Yeah, you can't control that in business. Bad things happen in business. You've got to be able to deal with them. And improvisation, I think, is a skill that is ignored because of this worry about control. What people don't realize about improvisation is whether it's jazz improvisation or improv comedy, it happens within a structure, right? Improvisation isn't just people going out and being wacko. Improvisation in jazz follows chord progression, happens underneath a melody, and it's got beats behind it, and you've got other instrumentation you're working with. So it happens within the context of what's going on in that song, and then people improvise, and it comes out brilliant. But it's not turn the world loose. It's a, how do I work within this situation and make something great come out of it? And I think that's what companies forget. And when something like this comes up, you've got to be able to implement.
Yeah, I have to mention Mike Bonifer, who's written several books, including The Art of Tron, because he was part of that movie. But then he's got a book that was published like really back in 2007 called Game Changers. And it's all about improvisation for business. And he's gone on to write other books, including No More Meetings, which would have been relevant to our earlier comment here. But definitely highly recommended. He's excellent. And you can use improvisation, including for strategy making. Because I remember he had a workshop once that kind of was talking about even that sort of a thing. So there's a lot to be said for that.
There is. And, I've used it a lot. And I was trained as a jazz musician, so I think I did a lot of creative work. And so creative work, it makes sense. Oh, yeah, we're going to have to do some improvisation. But it was interesting, even when filming a TV spot, I would have clients who would be frustrated that we hadn't micromanaged every shot. Well, why don't you have shooting boards which describe absolutely every shot? And I would say, well, because I want to see the shot on the TV screen coming off the camera so that I can move it around. I can change it. I can make it into what works better because I can see what's going on. And I know the overall thing we're trying to get, and I can make it a lot better with that flexibility. So I intentionally left room to make on-set decisions. A lot of production happens where people say, well, the script is, yeah, well, I'll tell you what I found is if the talent couldn't say the words, it wasn't the talent's fault. It was the script's fault, And if the talent, if we had talent that bumbled words probably 3 times was the point I'd go, wait a minute. And we'd have a discussion about how to reword it. And it fixed it every time. And the problem wasn't the talent. It was us, what we'd written. And sometimes you don't know that until you hear the talent stumble over the words. And then you go, oh, yeah, those don't work. And you have to be able to do that a lot of times. And I think, business has gotten so afraid of uncertainty that we try to script out everything. And honestly, what complexity shows us is that eliminates your opportunity.
Yeah, isn't that true? Yeah. So the other topic we mentioned in our pre-call was decision making.
Yeah. Interesting. Richard Shotton passed along a selection. I think it's from a Spectator article that Rory Sutherland wrote recently. And I've got the screen grab from that. And what it says, this is Rory Sutherland writing, one reason why our personal judgment may be rather good is that it is just that, personal. People are not forced to justify their choice of shampoo to a procurement officer. Or, and this is long, a lot of words here, or reverse engineer a pseudoscientific optimization model to pretend that their choice of sofa returns the highest possible ROI. As a result, they decide quickly and intuitively. The decision might seem irrational or suboptimal to an economist, but nonetheless, it works in the real world. And then goes on to say, by contrast, when people have to make a decision in a collective setting, their first instinct may not be to choose well, but to avoid blame.
My sort of half funny reaction to that was he's not recognizing that the spouse may very well be the procurement officer. But
well, there is that issue, that's okay. I've got a quote somewhere from this guy saying, the first organization in history was Adam and Eve, and we still haven't quite figured that one out. So I don't know why we think we can figure other organizations
we did figure
out.
It out.
That's true. That's true.
It's just that some people don't want to accept it.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. But I think I ended up with 2 responses to this. One is I really understand what he's saying. And I think there's something about, we make instinctively solid decisions in our personal lives. And then we arrive in business and begin to overthink everything into making bad decisions. So that is possible.
Yeah.
The thing that I believe that this misses is the value of the group along the way. And I think it's because we don't have good ways that we think about that. The way I look at it is this. If we discuss something as a group in a company, each person in that group has their understanding of the situation expanded. Just as you and I do when we talk through topics in our pre-show or even on air, it expands what each of us understands and sees. That is tremendously important for companies arriving at right answers. The problem is then companies take that valuable thing and then expect that making a decision or creating creative, for example, coming up with creative ideas is done by the group. And I think that's absolutely wrong. What we did in my company was we would meet and just hash things out and then go away. And for example, for me, I would find that when I'm away, it all of a sudden comes together in a new way that has an insight. And all of a sudden I see what we should, and we arrive at good answers. But I think that process of insight is personal. The process of expanding all of our understanding is group, and we have to kind of balance, go back and forth. And so I think that's the way I view personal stuff working. Certainly when it comes to products and product invention and things like that, new products generally do best when there's somebody watching out for their heart and soul. And I mean somebody, one person who groks, this is what this thing should be. And they may have a team around them that understands that with them, but somebody has to take the lead.
Yeah,
and
so
usually
as
it's one
usual,
person.
this kind of led me to think, what are we really focused on when we talk decision making? And I think the idea is making the right decision. So that's a complex thing because you don't always have all the info. You don't always know the implications of that decision. Sometimes that's a function of other things happening or not happening. There are like stories of, Zen thinking where a decision is good, it turns out to be bad, and then it turns out to be good again, and then it's bad again, depending on what happens, Like I remember it was like a children's book where, the guy's son like breaks his leg and then, oh, bad decision. But then the next day there's like a war and he can't go to the war because his leg is broken. So then he's grateful that didn't, and then like something else happened, then it comes bad again.
Yeah.
So there's also that, right?
Mhm.
So what is the urgency of the decision? If it needs to be like split second decision, like we see in James Bond movies, then we're delighted that it's him making a decision guided by the directors and the script, and it's always the right one. If it's the importance of the decision, like you're going through, like a major social decision, then it really a lot has to do with how you see the world and how you assess various benefits and risks. And then we talked about implications. What are the implications of that decision in a world that we live in? And so then really, simply because it is a group decision doesn't necessarily make it the better decision. It can if you're talking about democracy, right? And you say, okay, over the millennia, we have tried all other alternatives, and this is the best way to get to the right decision. And even that is not necessarily foolproof. We've had historical evidence of that.
Well, I always say that, democracy is, what's the quote out of England? Is the worst possible way to do anything except for all the other ways of doing it.
That's right.
And I
Is
think
that
there's
like
a
a
lot of
Winston
truth to it.
Churchill thing?
Yeah, well, Churchill, and I think he picked it up from somebody else. But I think, and I think there is truth to it. I mean, all decision making is messy. And if we try to make it clean, we aren't actually going to help ourselves necessarily. I think,
Right.
As we talked, though, I think there is some importance in that some decisions you have to worry so much about group buy-in on the choice. And I brought up, if you're in facilities and you're going to move everybody in a 10,000 person headquarters around, and you have some grand vision for making work more efficient as you move everybody's desks, you damn well better be talking department and divisions and everybody else and finding out why your plan is wrong.
Yeah.
Because you probably aren't right. And at some level, you need their buy-in. But sometimes group decision making run well.
It can be if the participants know enough to contribute, right? So, my advice usually has been that A, I want to be deliberate about decisions. And then B, I'm going to remember the circumstances in which I made that decision and the assumptions that I made to make that decision. Because that way I remember that I will, in the future, remember that, okay, let's remember that we made that decision because we assumed this, that, and the other, and that was our reality. So, let's not beat ourselves because it was wrong, because at the time it was the right thing, and let's not forget it. Because we'd also have that in companies where people say, how dumb can you get?
Two thoughts rolling through my mind. One is, there's an example from a book I've read, this woman who, a tremendous personal story behind it. But eventually, as she's trying to save her company, she negotiates plan-ahead contracts with 3 companies that raise the money she needs to save her company. And later on, venture capitalists, who are visiting the company are like, you would have been a lot better to structure that contract some other way. And her comment is, sometimes a bad decision is a good decision. because it's all context.
Yeah.
She's like, if I hadn't negotiated that contract, the company would have gone out of business. So is it better to have a perfect contract or have the company survive?
Right.
Obviously, we like the company survive.
Yeah.
But I think in retrospect, what she's pointing out is later people looking back have a real hard time understanding the context within which we made a decision. Because in reality, and this is part of complexity, as I say, look, complexity is about the whole result. Everything about complexity is about the whole result. Whether the contractor is good or bad is meaningless in a way, right? What matters is, did you arrive at the whole result? And then you can go back and maybe learn something by saying, well, what if the contract had been done a little different? Okay, that's not bad learning.
Right.
But to second guess those things, if the company has succeeded, second guessing those things is not particularly wise.
All right. So let's make a group decision to conclude this episode.
I don't know. I think I need to send you an email about that. It's pretty long and a little asinine and boring, but and meanwhile, I do want to make an observation that it's really nice that our primary software, Zencastr, is running, because I had a moment before we got on with wondering, I wonder if Zencastr will work today. So they did. So at least at the moment, we're okay.
That's right. No, good job, Zencastr team. The software is a great piece of software. We're a fan. Yeah. All right. Good stuff. Thank you, Doug. Thank you all for listening. All right. Until next time. Take care.
That's it for this episode of the Marketing Podcast. Every episode is posted on orionx.net and shared on social media. Use the comments section or tweet us with any questions or to propose topics. If you like the show, rate and review it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. The Marketing Podcast is a production of Orion X. Thank you for listening.